When your electricity bill doubles in the middle of winter, the cause isn't a war on the other side of the world, but a tariff fight with your neighbor. Millions of Americans in Michigan, Minnesota, and New York are now living this reality. Ontario Premier Doug Ford's declaration that he'll cut off electricity with a smile might sound theatrical, but the calculation behind it is cold and pragmatic. We're witnessing the weaponization of energy interdependence between the world's longest undefended border, and the implications go far beyond heating bills. The numbers tell a story that most Americans haven't fully grasped. Michigan alone imported $2.8 billion worth of Canadian electricity in 2025, powering roughly 600,000 homes during peak winter months. When Ford announced his 25% export surcharge, utility companies in Detroit and Grand Rapids immediately began calculating rate increases that would hit consumers within weeks. The political timing isn't coincidental. Primary election season means angry voters have immediate ways to express displeasure with policies that raise their heating costs. But here's what makes this crisis particularly revealing. Both sides are discovering that energy interdependence creates vulnerability they didn't anticipate. American trade negotiators assumed geographic proximity gave them leverage over Canadian suppliers. Canadian provincial leaders assumed long-term contracts and infrastructure investments made American retaliation too costly to contemplate. Both assumptions are now being tested in real time. Let's step back and look at the bigger picture. For decades, North American energy integration was sold as a win-win story. Canadian hydropower would help American states meet their climate goals, while American markets would provide steady revenue for Canadian provinces. Cross-border transmission lines were built not just to move electrons, but to cement an economic partnership that made military conflict between neighbors literally unthinkable. That assumption is now being tested in ways few policymakers anticipated. The technical complexity of this integration runs deeper than most realize. The Eastern Interconnection, one of North America's three major electrical grids, treats the U.S. Canada border as essentially invisible for power flow purposes. Electricity generated at Niagara Falls flows seamlessly into New York's grid. Quebec's massive James Bay hydroelectric complex has been sized specifically to serve New England markets during peak demand periods. Dismantling these relationships isn't like canceling a trade deal for manufacturing goods. It's like trying to separate conjoined twins. Investment banks are beginning to calculate the financial implications. Goldman Sachs estimates that sustained energy trade disruption could reduce Canadian provincial revenues by $8 or $12 billion annually, while increasing American consumer energy costs by $15–20 billion. But these aggregate numbers mask regional variations that make the political calculations more complex. Rural New York counties that benefit from cheap Canadian hydropower lean Republican, creating cross-party pressure on Trump's trade team that wasn't anticipated. The immediate trigger is clear enough. Trump's February 2025 tariffs hit Canadian exports with a 25% levy, ostensibly to pressure Canada on immigration enforcement. But here's where context matters. Canada already processes its own asylum claims, maintains one of the world's most selective immigration systems, and shares more intelligence with U.S. border authorities than any other country. The border security justification looks thin when you examine the actual data flows between the two countries. Border Patrol statistics reveal the disconnect between rhetoric and reality. In 2024, fewer than 23,000 people crossed from Canada into the United States outside official ports of entry, compared to over 2.4 million crossings at the southern border. Most Canada-U.S. border incidents involve American citizens trying to avoid customs duties on shopping trips, not international security threats. The fentanyl trafficking that Trump cites as justification primarily flows through Pacific shipping routes and the Mexican border, not through Canadian forests. This raises an uncomfortable question. If the stated justification doesn't match the actual problem, what's really driving the tariff policy? Trade data suggests the answer involves American manufacturing competitiveness rather than border security. Canadian lumber, steel, and aluminum have been capturing market share in American construction and automotive sectors. Energy tariffs might be cover for broader economic nationalism that's harder to justify politically. What's really happening is a stress test of economic nationalism against geographic reality. Trump's trade team appears to believe that American energy independence means the ability to dictate terms to energy suppliers. But independence and dominance are different concepts, and the distinction matters when your suppliers have other options. Consider the numbers that rarely make headlines. Canada supplies roughly 20% of U.S. electricity imports, but that modest percentage masks massive regional dependencies. New York imported 7.7 terawatt-hours from Ontario and Quebec last year, more than any other state. New England gets nearly 5% of its total power from Canada, mostly Quebec hydro. These aren't luxury imports that can be easily replaced. They're integral to keeping the lights on during peak demand periods. The timing patterns reveal the strategic nature of this trade. Canadian hydro imports typically spike during summer air conditioning season and winter heating peaks, exactly when American grid operators need reliable baseload power. Quebec Hydro has structured its dam release schedules around these predictable demand patterns, creating operational interdependence that goes beyond commercial contracts. Disrupting these flows doesn't just affect prices, it risks grid stability during the periods when electrical systems are most stressed. Massachusetts provides a case study in how quickly energy relationships can become political weapons. The state negotiated a 20-year power purchase agreement with Hydro-Quebec specifically to meet its 2050 carbon neutrality goals. That contract represents $10 billion in committed spending, backed by ratepayer guarantees that assume stable cross-border energy trade. If Quebec decides to redirect that power to other buyers, Massachusetts ratepayers remain liable for capacity charges even if no electricity flows. The replacement costs tell the real story. Building equivalent clean generating capacity within American borders would require massive wind and solar installations, plus battery storage systems that don't yet exist at necessary scale. Natural gas plants could fill the gap faster, but at the cost of undermining state climate commitments that depend on imported Canadian hydro. The infrastructure lead times mean that energy relationships severed today couldn't be rebuilt for 5 to 10 years, even with unlimited budgets. Here's where the story gets more complex. Ontario's 25% export surcharge isn't just retaliation. It's a demonstration of leverage that many in Washington didn't see coming. Energy markets operate on tight margins, and even small supply disruptions can cascade into price spikes that hit consumers directly. Ford knows that angry voters in Michigan and New York don't distinguish between federal trade policy and their local utility bills. But this raises uncomfortable questions about the nature of modern alliances. For 80 years, the U.S. Canada partnership was built on the assumption that shared democratic values and economic integration would prevent exactly this kind of economic warfare. That assumption is now being tested by an American president who views trade relationships as zero-sum competitions rather than mutual dependencies. Historical parallels offer sobering context. The 1956 Suez Crisis strained U.S.-UK relations when economic pressure was applied to allies over policy disagreements. The 1973 oil embargo demonstrated how energy relationships could be weaponized for political leverage, but those were conflicts between adversaries or distant partners. We're now watching democracies discover they can apply energy pressure to each other just as effectively as authoritarian regimes apply it to their enemies. European officials are paying close attention to how this unfolds. Germany's experience with Russian gas cutoffs taught painful lessons about energy dependency on unreliable partners. But the Canada-US dispute suggests that even democratic allies can become unreliable when domestic political calculations override alliance commitments. If America can't maintain stable energy trade with Canada, European planners wonder, what does that mean for transatlantic energy cooperation? The NATO dimension complicates everything. Article 5 collective defense commitments assume that alliance members won't engage in economic warfare against each other. Energy supply disruptions during winter heating season could arguably constitute attacks on civilian infrastructure, even when imposed by allies for trade leverage. Canadian defense officials haven't raised this interpretation yet, but the legal framework exists for escalation beyond trade disputes. The climate dimension adds another layer of complexity. New York and New England have built their carbon reduction strategies around increasing imports of Canadian hydropower. The Champlain-Hudson Power Express, connecting Quebec to New York City, represents billions in infrastructure investment premised on stable cross-border energy trade. If that trade becomes subject to political tariffs and counter-tariffs, state climate goals become hostage to federal trade disputes. Quebec Premier François Legault's hint that his province might consider breaking power supply contracts with Massachusetts adds urgency to this calculation. Quebec Hydro represents some of the cheapest, cleanest electricity in North America. Losing access doesn't just raise costs, it forces utilities back toward natural gas generation precisely when climate targets demand the opposite direction. The timing couldn't be worse for grid operators. Winter electricity demand is surging as heat pumps replace gas furnaces in the electrification push. New York grid operators project winter demand could double over the next 30 years. Canadian hydro was supposed to be the bridge fuel for this transition. Now it's becoming a political football that neither country can afford to drop. What's fascinating is how quickly both sides moved to weaponize interdependence. Trump imposed tariffs, Ford imposed export taxes, Quebec hints at contract cancellations. The escalation ladder is short when your leverage is literally turning off the lights. This suggests that energy interdependence, long viewed as a stabilizing force, can become destabilizing faster than anyone anticipated. The business community response reveals another dimension of this crisis. Over 500 American business organizations signed letters supporting USMCA renewal precisely because integrated supply chains depend on predictable trade rules. Energy utilities can't hedge against political risk when the political risk is your largest supplier deciding to tax your imports at 25%. Here's what we're not hearing enough about: the precedent this sets for other relationships. If a 25% tariff justifies energy export restrictions between democratic allies, what happens when trade disputes involve less friendly relationships? The global energy system depends on the assumption that commercial contracts transcend political disputes. That assumption is now in question. The legal complexity is worth examining. Electricity traditionally hasn't been subject to tariffs because electrons don't stop at customs offices. Grid operators in New England and New York have asked federal regulators for permission to collect trade levies in case electricity exports face tariffs. The bureaucratic absurdity of this request highlights how unprepared existing frameworks are for energy trade wars. But perhaps the most significant aspect of this crisis is what it reveals about the durability of democratic alliances. Canada and the United States share more than trade. They share integrated defense networks, intelligence systems, and environmental monitoring. NORAD doesn't function if the two countries are engaged in economic warfare over electricity imports. Canadian Foreign Minister Melanie Joly's statement that Canada won't be bullied by tariff threats represents more than trade policy. It signals that even the closest American allies are reassessing the costs of economic dependence on a country whose trade policy can shift dramatically every 4 years. The reputational damage from this dispute extends far beyond energy markets. Trump's team appears to calculate that Canada has no choice but to accept American terms because geographic proximity limits their alternatives. But this calculation misses how quickly new alternatives can emerge when trust breaks down. Canada is already deepening trade relationships with Europe and Asia. Energy relationships that took decades to build can be redirected faster than most Washington policymakers realize. The infrastructure reality complicates everyone's calculations. Power transmission lines represent 30-year investments that can't be easily redirected, but the commercial relationships that make those lines profitable can shift much faster. If Canadian provinces decide that American energy markets are too volatile to rely on, they'll find other buyers. China's appetite for Canadian resources isn't limited to oil and lumber. What happens next depends partly on factors neither government fully controls. Winter weather patterns affect heating demand, which affects electricity consumption, which affects the political pressure on both sides. A particularly cold February could make Ford's export surcharge feel like economic warfare to Michigan voters. A mild winter might give both sides room to de-escalate without losing face. The municipal level adds another variable. Mayors in border cities understand viscerally how quickly trade disputes can harm local economies. The mayor of Haines, Alaska, has already expressed concern about tariffs affecting normally friendly U.S. Canada relations. Local politicians often have more sense about these interdependencies than federal trade officials who see the world through spreadsheets rather than utility bills. Here's where things get really interesting. Neither side appears to have thought through the endgame. Trump's tariffs are supposed to pressure Canada on immigration policy, but Canada's energy restrictions pressure American consumers who have no control over immigration enforcement. Ford's export surcharges are supposed to demonstrate Canadian leverage, but they risk creating exactly the American energy nationalism that could justify more aggressive tariffs. The disconnect between stated goals and actual mechanisms suggests this crisis has taken on a life of its own. Trade wars have their own logic once they begin, and that logic doesn't always align with the political goals that started them. Both Trump and Canadian officials may find themselves trapped in escalation cycles that serve neither country's interests. This brings us to what might be the most important question. What happens to democratic alliance structures when economic interdependence becomes a source of conflict rather than cooperation? The post-World War II order was built on the assumption that trade relationships would make military conflicts between democracies unthinkable. But economic warfare between allies might be just as destabilizing. The rest of the world is watching this dispute carefully. European allies are asking whether American trade policy is reliable enough to justify deep economic integration. Asian partners are calculating whether diversity away from American markets might reduce political risk. The Canada dispute is sending signals far beyond North American energy markets. Perhaps the most sobering aspect of this crisis is how little either side seems to have learned from recent energy disruptions. Europe's experience with Russian energy weaponization should have taught policymakers that energy interdependence requires political stability to function.